when Brother Jason invited me to come, I had to shuffle a few things on my calendar, but I did so, and I came out of love and respect for him. I'm all in with my students. I tell them, you ask and the answer is yes, unless it has to be no. And I thought I was coming to give. I didn't understand the Lord brought me here to receive. My, oh my, the men of God that have been standing here and getting out of the way of the text so that it can transform our hearts. Thank you, men. Thank you. I'm going to hurry up and preach this sermon so I can go sit down and hear the next one. Please do go to the website and get those books. You'll have to wade through some others. The Fresh Devotional book is the one that's for October to December. It's a little Christmas gift to you with some Christmas devotionals, and you'll need to click on the Kindle version. For the Fresh Illustration book that I'm giving you, preachers especially, it's on faith, hope, and love, because I've heard an awful lot of that around here. And then my book, Soul Shaping, that was the 2010 doctrinal study for Southern Baptist. And when it came out of print, I got the rights back, and now I'm trying to give it away as many places as I can so that it may bless people to help them walk closer with God. And if you find those books of value, then what I would encourage you to do is to get out your checkbook and write a check to the camp here and help encourage this ministry. I'm sure they need donations at other times of the year than Labor Day. Am I right? If you don't find it of value, please keep that quiet. I just assume people not know that. Yesterday, I had the high privilege of standing before you and talking to you a little bit about grace. And that God's grace is especially beneficial to us when we're not receiving it, but when we're observing someone else receive it and we're able to rejoice. And I dealt with some of my own sin in a public manner that there's times that that's hard for me. I'm working on it. I'm a recovering Pharisee. Today, I'd like to continue to talk about grace, especially in light of the journey we took last night to the cross. How could I preach on anything else but grace this morning? But today I'd like to share with you that the grace we give today impacts eternity. And if observing grace that others receive is a higher, more spiritual way to approach grace, then giving grace, being the conduit of grace, of God's grace, not just flowing to you, but through you to others, is higher still. And so today I'd like to spend some time with one of my very favorite Bible stories. See, I went to school in Plainview, Texas. That's where I went to college, but it's also where I went to elementary school at Edgemere Elementary. And Mrs. Walls, my 5th grade teacher, would read to us from the Bible when we came in from recess. And I recall her telling us to put our face down on that linoleum desk and rest for a moment. And I recall to this day hearing the story of Joseph. So will you join me? And there's no linoleum desk. You can put your face on, but will you join me in turning to Genesis chapter 41? We'll read a good bit of text today. One of my beliefs about preaching is I'm not here to summarize the text. I'm here to read the text because I can't mess that up. I've messed up the summarization a time or two. But if nothing else, you will hear the Word of God today because I'm going to read it. Genesis chapter 41, and we'll read verse 34 through 42. And I hope you don't mind standing as we read. You know, every now and then you'll hear somebody say, well, I won't stand for that. Well, brothers, I'll stand for the Word of God. How about you? Verse 34, let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take a fifth of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all of the excess food during these good years that are coming. And under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so they might preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt, and the country will not be wiped out by the famine. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? Can we pause for just a moment and ponder that question? Can we find anyone like this? A man who has God's Spirit in him. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as intelligent and as wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all the people will obey your commands. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, see, I am placing you over the land of Egypt. Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with a fine linen garment. Folks, he was wearing his prison stripes, and clothed him with his fine linen garments and placed a gold chain around his neck. May God add His blessing to this reading of His Word. You may be seated. The events unraveled just as Joseph said they would. There were 7 years of plenty, and it was followed by 7 years of famine. And during the years of plenty, Joseph had 2 sons by the wife that Pharaoh gave him, and he oversaw the storage of the grain for the famine. In Genesis 41:55 it says, so when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, and whatever he says to you, you will do. Now verse 55 puts it as clearly as it can be put. This man had absolute power. They turned to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, you're talking to the wrong man. You need to talk to Joseph. He had absolute power. And as the famine progressed, people from everywhere came to Egypt because they heard there was bread in the house in Egypt. My mind just went crazy, and I remembered that Bethlehem means house of bread. There was bread in that house too, wasn't there? One of the groups of visitors who knelt before Joseph, asked for help, was Joseph's brothers. When Joseph was just a child, he had a dream. He had a vision from the Lord that one day his brothers would bow down before him. Now, I suspect that as a young man, that dream meant something different to Joseph than it did as an older man. See, as a young man, I suspect as he told that, it was with an attitude. It was with, you may be my bigger brothers now, but one day, the Lord has told me, one day. But I suspect that now there is a heart of gratitude. See, there's a difference between a young, inexperienced, arrogant man holding the mace of power and a man that has been shaped by the crucibles of suffering. Administering somebody else's power. You see, Joseph had no power except that which was given him. And before you say that it was Pharaoh's power, I need you just to look up a little bit. There is no room for any man or woman to believe they own the power they have. Now, power is simply the combination of influence plus authority. That's all it is. God gives some great influence. God gives others great authority. And to a few, He gives a combination of both. And those with that combination, those powerful people, are the ones that must be directed by God. They must be meek. Like Moses and Jesus were said to be meek. They must be meek, which is power under control. See, when Joseph saw his brothers in front of him, he had a heart of gratitude. That God had put him in a position where he could help his own family. They told Joseph that they were 10 of 12 sons from the land of Canaan. They wanted to buy some food, and according to the brothers, the youngest brother was still at home, and his older brother, Benjamin's older brother, was dead. Joseph pretended not to believe their story, and he accused them of being spies, and he threw them into jail for 3 days. Now, if we could read this with fresh eyes, we'd scratch our head and say, well, they shouldn't have thrown him into the pit. They shouldn't have sold him into slavery. They shouldn't have told his daddy that he was dead. Now Joseph's a powerful man. Their coming-uppings are coming up. And I believe that's the way we should look at this text in this moment right now. Because that's how they were experiencing it. They were in trouble. Now, they didn't know it was Joseph exacting revenge. They didn't think that, but they did think God was. Well, as the days passed, Joseph released all but one of them, and he sent some grain home with them. And he said, but don't return, don't come back without your youngest brother. I need proof that you're telling me the truth. And so the brothers spoke to one another in their language, not knowing that was Joseph's language, and that he could understand them. And they grieved over what they had done to Joseph years ago, believing that God was punishing them for that sin. And when Joseph heard what they said, he left the room and he wept. The story of Joseph is a story of fives. There's 5 different garments that he wore through the story. And the garment motif helps us to see the story as it progresses. From the garment of favoritism that his father gave him all the way to the death shroud that he wore at the end. It's a story of 5s. Because there's also 5 times in his story that he cried. They say that grown men don't cry. Okay. They don't usually cry in front of one another. But we cry. Especially those that get a glimpse of their sinfulness. We cry. Especially those that are haunted by memories. We cry. Joseph left the room and he wept. He returned and he sent the brothers away with the grain. And they brought with them a special package they didn't know about. In the bag there was the money that they had given for the grain. And you say, well, why did Joseph do that? Well, you don't understand. Joseph was not in the grain selling business. Joseph was in the grace business. You don't sell grace. Those brothers were not taking something home because they had earned the equivalent of it and exchanged it for the price of the grain. They had earned none of it. It was not for sale. You can't buy grace. It's not for sale. Well, when the brothers made it home, they told the father what had happened. And they told him that they had to take Benjamin back. And they said that their brother Simeon was there to verify the story. So to redeem Simeon, they'd have to go back with Benjamin. And I want you to look at his reply, and please, would you please, listen to his reply from Genesis 42:38 with the ears of his sons that were listening. But Jacob said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left." Did you hear that? You're standing beside 8 of your brothers. One of them is back. Right? And you're listening to your daddy. And he says, his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. And you say that what he means is that he's the only one left from Rachel, his favorite wife. But before you go there, I need to ask you a question. At the end of his life, where did Jacob ask to be buried? Yes, sir. He asked to be buried next to Leah, not Rachel. And besides that, even if that is what he meant, do you think that's what these boys heard? You see, they were young men again and felt just exactly the way they did when they saw Joseph dressed in that garment of extremities that had varied colors, that garment of favoritism, that garment of favoritism that so angered them, they ripped it off of his body and they soaked it in blood and used it as proof that the boy was dead. But the food ran out. Some of you have asked me a little bit about my sermon yesterday, wanting more explanation about why I felt that that parable was about the older brother, not the younger. Well, it's the same reason that we're reading here. The younger boy's food ran out. That's why he went home. I've counseled with many parents that had prodigal children that came home when they were hungry, and 3 days later they were out again. The story of the prodigal son ends too soon. We don't know what happened, do we? See, the food runs out. When you get hungry, you get motivated. When you get hungry, you do things you don't normally do. See, Jacob got hungry, and he rethought the situation. And so he had a change of mind, and he sends gifts along with Benjamin, and they stood before Joseph, and Joseph instructed the servants to prepare a feast and invite the brothers to his house for dinner. See, this wasn't business. No, this was grace. This was grace. And when he saw Benjamin with his brothers, you know what he did, don't you? He went into a private room, and that grown man, that second most powerful man in Egypt, that grown man went into a room and he wept. And after dinner, the stewards filled their sacks with the grain and the money they brought, but that's not all they put in. They put in Joseph's special cup. The trap was set. And now Joseph was ready to spring it. Returning to the text, chapter 44, verse 4 through 5. They had just gone out of the city, and they were not far off when Joseph said to his house steward, "Up, follow the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid evil for good? Is this not the one from which my Lord drinks, with which he indeed uses for divination? You have done wrong in doing this.'" Now, why is Joseph doing this? Is he exacting revenge? Is this a diabolical plot? Well, it is, for one thing, a turning point in the story. It is what is going to propel the future. It is what is going to force their father to come, because Joseph's goal was not just to see little Benjamin. Joseph's goal was to see his father. So the trap was set. While these actions appear vengeful, they're not. He knew his daddy had something going for him. It was a love for that boy, and his daddy would do anything for that boy. And so, they're encountered, they're confronted, they're brought back. And then Judah makes a passionate plea. Judah makes a passionate plea. He says, "Take me instead of Benjamin. Throw me in jail, not Benjamin." Judah. Do you hear which brother did it? Judah. Now, that's going to be very important in just a moment. Please do not forget that name. Judah says, I'll take his place. Judah says, I'll bear the penalty. Judah says, take me. Let him go free. Then in Genesis chapter 45, verse 1 through 15, we see what happens next. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly. You see, sometimes when grace is a-flowing, sometimes grown men don't go in the corner to cry. He wept so loudly, the scripture says. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold to slavery. And now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Your evil was to save lives. That God sent me here ahead of you. Brothers, you thought you were in charge. No, there is a sovereign God that is in charge of the affairs of man. There is a God that notices when a bird falls from the sky. There is a God that knows the number of hairs that's on your head. And that God sent me here. It was that God that brought me here to save lives. Oh, that when we go through trials, we could look up and see that God is still sitting on his throne. America, there are other men and women that sit on thrones and give judgments. But they don't sit on his throne. And they can pronounce that wrong is right, but it doesn't change a thing. It was God that sent him there. Verse 6, for 2 years now there's been famine in the land. In the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph said. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay. You shall live in this region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because of 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourself, so that you can, my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin, and he wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all of his brothers, and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers, they talked with him. I suspect that there are few people in life who have suffered more injustice than Joseph. They had done him wrong from the beginning. When they sold him into slavery, it was wrong. When Potiphar's wife seduced him, it was wrong. When she accused him, it was wrong. When he was thrown into jail, it was wrong. In jail, when the prisoners forgot their promise, it was wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. They'd all treated him wrong. If anyone had the right to go in the corner and sulk, it was Joseph. If anyone had the right to exact revenge, it was Joseph. They had done him wrong. But Joseph had an understanding. He understood that his pain and suffering was simply collateral damage that he went through to be a conduit of God's grace. It wasn't about him. See, folks, that's the biggest hindrance to reading and understanding the Bible. You think it's about you. This book is not about you. It's not here to tell you how to have a happy life. It's not here to tell you how to raise your children. It's not here to tell you how to have a good marriage. It's here to reveal God to you. And God is on every page. This story is not about Joseph. It's not about his brothers. It's about God. It's about God who is in charge. It's about God that is gracious. It's about God that cares for his people. God's all over this text. And Joseph says as much. It's not about me. It's about God, and it's about preserving lives. And certainly it was about preserving the life of his father and his brothers, but see, that's just surface interpretation. Who was it? Which brother was it? Who was it? I don't remember. Who was it that stood up? Who was it? It was Judah. What tribe did Jesus descend from? You see, he is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, but he is also the Lion from the tribe of Judah. You see, Joseph wasn't just being gracious to his brothers. His grace had eternal consequences. Today I stand here, a man who is blood bought, who is redeemed, because Judah went free. Judah, the one that says, I'll take the punishment for his sins. Judah, the one that says, imprison me, let him go free. His descendant. His descendant. The Lion from the tribe of Judah was the Lamb that was slain. And he looked to the Father and said, I'll take his sins. I'll take his punishment. You let him go free. Did Joseph know this? No, didn't have a clue. He just knew the God that knew it. That's all he knew. So what do we do with this? Because I suspect that everyone in this audience has a somebody's done me wrong story. Maybe it was one of your kids or your parents or your boss or your ex. What are you going to do with it? Last night, two great preachers walked us to the foot of the cross. And we saw God's grace. No, I didn't experience it. I took a jacuzzi bath in it. I soaked in it. What are we going to do with it? Do you realize that when we choose not to forgive those who have harmed us, we are saying, not this sin, God, not this one. It's not covered by your blood, God. Not this one. The truth is, that's not ours to say. Grace is never owned by its recipients. I too have been wronged. And I have chosen not to be gracious. I don't have any grace, but to allow God's grace to rule. I want to ask you to do something right now. I want to ask you to take that wrong that's come to your mind already. It's surfaced. And I want you to put it in a gunny sack, would you? And I want you to throw it on your back and go for a walk with me. It's an uphill battle. It's a rocky journey. But I want you to walk with me with that gunny sack of pain to the foot of the cross. And I want you, as Jesus did from that cross, and Stephen did as he was looking back to the cross, to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they were doing. I want you to leave that bag right there. Now wait. I don't want you to turn and walk away too soon. Let me tell you the consequences of this decision. That story that goes with that sin that's in that bag, you can never tell it again. God owns that story. He's redeemed it. You can't tell that story again. Now, I know you'll think about it again, but when you do, you tell that slimy serpent that lied to the woman, you don't understand. That's been forgiven. If it is a high use of grace to rejoice when someone else receives it that doesn't deserve it, then it is higher still to be the one that gives it. We live in a society that needs the salt and the light to be gracious as they speak their truth. And the good news is, Grace can't flow through you without you getting soaked. May He soak us in His grace today.